Hey everyone, my name is Terrell Parker and I am a manager in NMAC Center to End the Epidemics. I'm really excited to talk to everyone today about an important topic, HIV-related stigma and ending the HIV epidemic in the United States. So I have an illustrious panel of experts here to share their experiences, their story, and to tell how HIV-related stigma directly impacts people living with HIV and what we can do to reduce stigma to end the HIV epidemic in the United States. So let's get started. All right, the first question, how does HIV-related stigma impact people living with HIV specifically? So I'm gonna start to my right. So Adam, I'll start with you.
When thinking about how stigma affects people with HIV, I kind of think about it in two different ways. There are the clinical implications, right? We know that stigma has a direct relationship to affecting people's viral loads, CD4 count, adherence. So, it just makes us sicker, right, from the beginning. But I think it's also important to take into consideration not just the clinical aspects of our lives, but the social aspects of our lives. Stigma has always been, in my mind, this idea that removes you from the safety and security of society, right? The places and spaces that we feel safe and welcomed, and it moves you outside of that. When I look at it, I say we've got two things here. It makes us sick, and it traumatizes us. And those, to me, I think are the barriers that we have to look at our systems because it's generated from the system.
Like Adam was talking about, the stigma that's placed does cause a set of trauma, but also when you talk about the stigma, we also have to talk about the socioeconomic issues that impact the epidemic. Most people that are the closest to an HIV diagnosis are also closer to the poverty line. And so we know that people in this country, when you're closer to the poverty line and you're a part of an underserved community and you're a minority, all of those stigmas directly impact how you feel about yourself and how you feel about this epidemic. And so not only is the internal stigma so harsh because you judge yourself about living with HIV, but that external stigma, the stuff you hear from your friends, your teachers, your colleagues, your coworkers, things you see on the media directly impact the HIV epidemic. And so I think that it is debilitating for people living with HIV. And although we have so many biomedical interventions like PrEP and all of these other wonderful things that can not only impact those that are negative, but also those living with HIV, we haven't addressed the stigma. And stigma has been the underlying issue of HIV.
So Lauren, from your experience, how does HIV-related stigma impact people with HIV?
Well, I want to say first that HIV stigma is probably one of the biggest obstacles for people living with HIV to live healthy, happy lives. And we know this, and we've known this for a while, but it's off the boundary to it is how do we move past the biomedical interventions to actually where people are in their lives, in their everyday lives, as they interact with their family, their friends, their loved ones. And stigma plays the biggest roles in all of those areas as folks are in the house or in their living space with their families and being stigmatized in relationships, stigmatized in community. And all of this stops people from living their healthiest, happiest lives. Because I believe that the internal stigma is as big as the external stigma. Is how I feel about me when I'm in space and when I'm in community, and I might not say it to anybody, but I might feel like I'm not good enough. So if I don't feel like I'm good enough, then I might not be on my best behavior all the time. I might not show up in the way that people want me to show up because I don't feel like I'm worthy. I will say this too, that as in this work, I've had the privilege of working with people with HIV, having friends that have HIV, having lovers that are also living with HIV. So with all of those different dimensions of folks around me who are not only involved in the work, but are in my space, I do feel a little bit more freedom. But it's internal. It's internal, so I think that that's the biggest battle with stigma for me. And I would say that for other people as well, it's internally.
We mentioned the different layers of stigma. I think oftentimes in the work that we do, we just leave it at stigma, but we don't go the level deeper.
Yeah.
We don't have the language to really say this is internalized stigma. You know, this is enacted stigma. This is what stigma looks like at the policy level.
Definitely.
You know, and I think all of those things truly create a different outcome as a result of how an individual, you know, or even as a community experiences those lived experience. So it's, I mean, we have some work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So talking about the work, I'd like to transition to another question. We've identified that stigma as a challenge. It impacts people living with HIV. It impacts our ability to sustain relationships. It impacts our ability to engage in care, to reach viral suppression. How do you see people living with HIV resisting and breaking down stigma? I'd like to start with Marnina on this question. And even from your perspective, or just in general, how do you see people living with HIV combating stigma?
So since the beginning of this epidemic, people living with HIV have always been at the forefront to combat stigma. Since 1983, when they met for the Denver Principles, it was 12 cishet gay men that decided a Bill of Rights for people living with HIV. And the opening statement was, "We are people with AIDS." And that's where you see people first language first start. And they are saying, I am not my diagnosis, I am a person living with AIDS. And so since then, people have really used people first language. They have used language justice. They have also used making sure that they are not just looking at cis-hate gay men. They have also looked at the epidemic as a whole and said, hey, we need to include Black women in this conversation. We need to include trans women in this conversation. And so it has made sure that we are all making sure that we are as we see the epidemic, we are all making sure that folks know that this epidemic exists with different marginalized communities. And so I think this epidemic, even though this is an epidemic that has impacted so many different communities, we have all gathered around each other to make sure that everyone is seen. And so I think that's the way that people living with HIV have really thrived in this movement. And I think a lot of other movement spaces should take a look and see what we're doing here, because we are really doing the work to make sure that people that are closest to the problem are the closest to that solution.
Okay.
I think being able to have an unapologetically healthy sex life when people, first of all, don't want you to exist, don't want you to have sex, criminalize you and your sexuality. I think that is the biggest way that we resist. Every time that we take our retroviral medications and we are undetectable and we go out and we fall in love, or however that looks for us, I think that is the biggest way that we resist as people. You know, for me, for many years, I was a sex worker. I've shared that with you before, Terrell, but I'm going to share it here on this platform. But I was a sex worker, and U equals U for me was freedom, because I was able to survive, right? And know that I wasn't, for lack of better terms, hurting anyone else. That, you know, I like to tell folks that HIV is not a possession. It's not something that I have. It's something I'm living with. And because I'm living with it and it's not a possession that I have, I can't give it to you, love. It is it's literally something I'm living with. So I think for me in my life, that was my biggest resistance, to be able to say, yes, I'm a sex worker. And yes, I'm also a person living with HIV, and I'm also undetectable. And I know that when we both leave this room, we're going to leave the same way that we came in.
U equals U is so powerful, and living with HIV, I understand it so much more from a different perspective. I've been working in the workforce for over 10 years now, but as I shared earlier, I'm 1 year into living with HIV. And U equals U has been so powerful, because when I tell people my sex life has not stopped at all since I've acquired HIV, my sex life has picked up.
And got better, probably.
And got better.
I definitely
Okay, it got better. And I think it's because of the work of advocates, the work of people saying that U equals U is a thing. It works. Undetectable equals untransmittable. So for me, that's been empowering, because I was really nervous. I was worried, how am I going to disclose to people my status? I've been a clear counselor. I've done CRCS, so if you know those interventions, I've counseled people on how to disclose their status to other people, but I wasn't living with HIV. It's because of the work of people living with HIV that I can say that I'm undetectable, and at least where I live in my community of Black gay men, they know what that means. And that, we couldn't say that 5 years ago, 10 years ago. You know, so that's powerful, and I think it's credit to the work that people living with HIV has done.
I think ESCALATE is so innovative. And MAC and ESCALATE really took a MIPA approach to this process. From the creation of the content to implementation to talking about this as we are now, all parts of it are from people living with HIV. And it's the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV that are going to transform lives with this training. And ESCALATE with the stigma reduction is something that people don't normally talk about. People talk about our behaviors, about how we have sex, who we have sex with, when we're having sex with. No one talks about the stigma that we face and how that stigma won't allow me to get out of bed in the morning, won't allow me to go to my doctor's office or seek care or even talk to my parents about my status. And so I think that that's something innovative that MAC is doing. And I'm so proud to be on the ESCALATE team. And what I want to say is NMAC builds leaders, because I remember being a part of a training, sitting there with Daniel and Terrell. And I was definitely a knucklehead. But Daniel and Terrell really honed in on my leadership skills, and they saw my leadership potential. And so they have been so influential in that process.
About to become one of those
Okay,
days.
okay. We're about performance today. Oh my God.
And so for me to go from a little girl sitting in that training room just like, here they go talking to me, to now really wanting to be influential in my community to change the stigma around it is huge. And so MAC and ESCALATE does that for folks. And I hope that people will take part in this program and really see the growth and potential that it has for the community.
So ESCALATE is a great program. It offers so many benefits, and it's really geared to empower people living with HIV to own their voice, to own their truth, to own their stories, their experiences, to reduce stigma so that we can end the HIV epidemic. Because like Marlena said, we're dealing with a lot of stigma. And if we're going to end HIV, the HIV epidemic in the United States, I'll say this until I'm blue in the face, we have to end stigma, because I don't think that we can end HIV in the United States without ending stigma. So thank you all for joining. Appreciate your time.